Hello, everyone. Chris Martenson, CEO of Peak Prosperity, here with a very special guest. I'm very excited to have with us today the Chicken Little itself, Doomberg. Doomberg, welcome to the program. So good to have you here today.
Chris, long time in the making. Really thrilled actually to be able to speak with you today. I know it's going to be a great discussion.
Indeed it is. And so for people who aren't familiar with you, a little background, because you really came out of, for me, nowhere. May of 2021, an article comes out. You developed a very rapid following. You built everything around social media, Substack being a primary place, doomberg.substack.com. Everybody should subscribe. But you really came on the scene rather suddenly in great style, as far as I'm aware. So what can you tell us about your background, your interest, and why you started writing about these things?
It's kind of fun to hear you say that. Obviously, there's no such thing as an overnight success, and there's a lot of decades of experience and practice and know-how that go into creating a project like this. But we're a very small team of former industrial executives from the commodities sector. We had built up a pretty reasonable consulting firm advising high net worth individuals, family offices, and C-suite executives on all things energy, commodities, markets, science, and finance. And COVID hit, and like a lot of small business owners, it was really damaging to our business. I think at our apex, we probably lost 85% of our revenue over a period of 60 days. And we like to characterize that as a high pucker factor moment for the members of our team. And what do you do? And do you reinvent yourself, or do you split up and go try and get a job? And on the advice of a pretty famous hedge fund manager, we decided to reinvent ourselves. And we began consulting in the content creation space, and in particular, the subset of people who create content that is predominantly consumed by Wall Street. And that was quite life-changing. And, take that lemon and turn it into lemonade. We learned a lot about the space. And by the time May of 2021 rolled around, on the advice of one of our clients, we decided to start our own thing. But we were well prepared to execute based on a disciplined strategy. And we've shared many aspects of that strategy with our subscribers as we built this following along the way. And it is truly what we were meant to be doing with our lives. And one of my strongest piece of advice that I give to my children and to anybody who listens is, when you find what you were meant to be doing in life, you just keep doing it. That's not that complicated. And we write 6 to 8 articles a month on energy, finance, and the economy at large, whatever catches our interest. The thing that I think differentiates Doomberg from most other content creators that serve Wall Street is we come from the industrial perspective. We bring that lens of industry, and most people with relevant industrial experience are prohibited from freely expressing themselves on the topics of the day. And so we're sort of competing against academicians and people from government, sort of professional pontificators, as we would call them. And we bring the real practical lens. So I think that's something that really resonates with our audience. And again, we have, I'm a scientist by training. We have pretty strong finance background on our team as well. And so that combination of explaining basic, fundamental scientific concepts in language that financial professionals can understand and then internalize into their own investment decision-making process is I think the thing that makes Doomberg unique. And so we're just going to keep doing it. It's really just a thrill to do. Imagine waking up every day and doing what you were meant to be doing in your life and making a living doing it. It's truly a thrill.
Well, I get to do that too. So, I'm just thrilled to be able to do that. And it took me a while. I'll be honest. I did a lot of things. I found out what I was good at by doing things I shouldn't have been doing. It took me a while to get there, but I'm not afraid to take those risks and jumps. And so I'm blessed because I wake up every day doing what I know my strongest core strengths are meant to do. And it's an incredible blessing. But the key, if anybody said, "Hey, how did you get where you are?" My answer would be persistence. So you say 6 to 8 articles per month that you guys are writing. That's just how that is. When you get into that lifestyle, it's amazing, but you've gotta keep at it, right? There's no like, well,
Yeah.
bad month, we're taking it off. That doesn't work.
It's funny you should say that, because one thing we pride ourselves on is our readers never know when we go on vacation. They never know. Like, we don't take holidays, at least outwardly. We live to delight our ideal clients, who are our paying subscribers, of course. And we again, when it's not work, when you get to do what you are doing all day, as opposed to having to do, something all day.
Right.
It's a world of difference.
Yeah.
And truly, one of the things that we're most proud of is that we have not lost sight of the fact of just how fortunate we are to have created this. But like you mentioned, this is probably the eighth incarnation of various business efforts that we've had over the years together as a small team. And some of them worked very well, some of them failed spectacularly, and all of them taught us something and led to the product that we've been able to develop today. And we have incorporated, the good, the bad, and the ugly from our prior experiences, and we've had them all. And as anybody who's tried to carve out a life on their own and eat what you kill, as we like to say,
Yeah.
when you do finally conquer it, it's important to not lose sight of the foundation of work that went into it and the joy that you should be able to extract by having accomplished it. We celebrate it as families. We don't take for granted a single day or nor a single subscriber. This could go away at any moment, and we're going to savor every day where it's flourishing like it is now.
Well said. Well said. And I think you left something out of your secret sauce too, which is incredibly creative communication. I come away from every article learning something. You do great framing and context, and these are things that I think are fundamentally missing. Judgment time from our larger dialogue that's going on out there. COVID was just an absolute travesty of missing context. Everybody should get a shot. Really healthy 12-year-olds. I mean, it was just like there was all the nuance evaporated. Everything we knew about science had just sort of like went poof, and it was a bizarre moment. And the opportunity, though, is that for people who can actually provide context, treat their audience with respect as if they are other intelligent adults, which they are, and then communicate, take the time, people will value that. And so I think,
No question, no
it's a
question
sign of
about
the
it.
times for both of us here.
This is the
If that makes
market
sense.
inefficiency that the traditional media has left open for people like us to go and exploit, and thank them for doing so. And as you say, in our hyperpolarized, hyperpolitical environment, the potential for nuanced conversation where people of intelligent backgrounds with a good track record of learning and listening can debate, disagree, figure out the points where they disagree, and then come to terms. That's just not allowed anymore. But people still hunger for it, and so it is the alternative media like Substack that is facilitating such conversations. And to the extent that Substack has been, consistent with their core of freedom of expression and free speech, which is really foundational to the country, we're going to stick by them as partners, and so anything we can do to help them, and vice versa. Ultimately, we're strong believers in regression to the mean, and the media has gotten so out of whack from everyday life and so partisan and so one-sided in their analysis, so gaslighting. I mean, people know when they're being gaslit. And this is the exact inefficiency in the market that allows brands like ours to flourish.
Exactly. So I want to go to some of that gaslighting, and some of it is just gaslighting and it's annoying. Some of it is dangerous. So one area I'm really excited to get you on for, to help me understand it, help our listeners understand it better, is can we talk about green energy for a bit? And in particular, what's left of my hair stood on end. It was a couple months ago. I'm reading about, just by an example, New York State's legislature says, hey, we're going to put laws, legislatively pass laws, governor signs them to eliminate gas peaker plants. That's like 50% of their electricity production at certain points. We're just going to get rid of those because they wanted to foster a more market-friendly environment for green energy adoption, which I likened in a piece I wrote to this is Cortez, 15 whatever, sailing across an ocean. His sailors are a little like not interested in doing much, so he burned the boats. And it's like, no way but forward. We got to go into the jungle, guys. And so that's what how do we interpret what's going on there? I know you just wrote about Ontario, the energy, the end in Germany. To me, this feels dangerous to me, because what they're really saying is we're going to force adoption of a technology that doesn't seem to have a market force behind it. And we have no way of proving that we can subsist on this alone, or that it can regenerate or rebuild itself, and on and on. Where do you fall on that story? Like, how do we begin to interpret what these people are up to?
It's fascinating that you leave with this question, because I just saw a really amazing chart from my good friend Nate Hagans, who does a really amazing job at thinking deeply about these energy problems. And this chart, which I'll describe, shows just how rapidly the incremental benefit of a stable grid falls off as you encounter grid instability. And it's
Mm.
several percentage points of reliability that you need to lose before the vast majority of the benefit of a just-in-time, always-on, stable grid accrues to society. And the example that you've mentioned is just the latest manifestation in what we would call utter energy ignorance on the part of our state leaders who have spent no time in industry, have no relevant scientific training, and yet are feel emboldened to undo the work of the generations that have come before us to provide us with this amazing, reliable, always-on grid that is the core foundation from which every other aspect of modern society flourishes. And peaker plants, in particular, for those that aren't familiar, are basically the backup grid that is necessitated by the forced introduction of intermittent, weather-dependent renewable energy sources like solar and wind. And we can all pretend like these fancy green projects are nothing more than nuances, but at a point when they become a bigger and bigger portion of the grid, they do begin to threaten that grid reliability. And if you go from 99.99% reliable grid to 97% reliable grid, you've lost way more than 3% of the benefits of a grid. Industries can't produce. Manufacturing sectors leave. The grid reliability is table stakes for a modern first world developed economy. And we have lost sight of that. So this generation, energy comes from a light switch. They flick the switch and the light comes on. There's no direct visceral understanding for the men and women working in the energy sector who provide all of the necessary resources to make that happen, to make that miracle happen. I mean, our society today would be indistinguishable from magic to people just 100 years ago, 50 years ago in most of the country, actually. And so we take this for granted. We are arrogant about it, actually, is the word that I would use. And the environmentalists, radicals, Malthusian anti-humans that form the genesis of the modern, the Sierra Club and Greenpeace and so on, their intent is to destroy our lifestyle because they view human flourishing as necessarily degrading nature, quote unquote. And so it doesn't surprise me that the fools in charge of the New York State grid have decided that they no longer need peaker plants, that they can just make do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and they don't need the reliable fossil fuel powered facilities to make up for when the weather doesn't turn in our favor. And by the way, it will. Like, it's inevitable that there will be doldrums where the wind doesn't blow and it's nighttime, and there's no amount of quote unquote capacity that you can install that would circumvent the need for grid reliability. And so our view is there's a finite amount of pain that needs to be absorbed before people reconcile with physics. We hope that that pain isn't very high. We suspect it's higher than most people realize. And ultimately, there will be a revolt, and these foolish policies will be overturned.
My concern, and thank you for that, because that comports with a lot of what I think as well, although I'm not as deeply imbued in the industry and how it actually operates, but I study carefully enough to know that the one thing that worries me the most is grid down. If we get to grid down, that's more than anything else, more than a pandemic, more than practically anything, except maybe thermonuclear war or something. But grid down, that just ends life as we know it, and possibly life for a lot of folks. If you've seen the 1 second after, or read any of Alice Miller's, when the trucks don't move kind of a thing. It's very central. And so they're really playing with our our prosperity, if not our lives. But how do you have an explanation yet for how that energy ignorance got so widespread that it seems to have infected the Germans, a lot of the UK, a good chunk of Europe, Canada, the United States? Like, where did this come from, this set of ideas?
It's truly a luxury of the rich. If you're struggling to have a reliable grid, you're not foolish enough to bet the future of your prosperity on the weather. And so a whole generation of people have been sold a big lie. And the big lie is this: there is a path to decarbonization that involves no sacrifice. And our refusal to embark on that path is because of corrupt fossil fuel companies. That's just a giant lie. There's no other way to say it. Like, 85% of our total energy still comes from fossil fuels today, despite spending trillions of dollars trying to diversify away from it. It's a foolish endeavor. There's certainly no path to any meaningful decarbonization that doesn't run squarely through nuclear power, the highest energy dense source of primary energy available to humankind today. And to think that we could turn back the clock to go back to burning biomass and capturing the wind is somehow progress. The big lie. Look, we could decarbonize. There's just going to be an awful lot of dead people, and an awful lot of riots and social unrest, civil disobedience on the path from abundance to starvation is riot, and the people will riot. And our progressives lose sight of the path function. The path function matters, and the speed with which they are assuming that we must decarbonize in a at the altar of the god of carbon, as we call it. This is, I mean, it's the luxury of the rich. It's utter nonsense, and it won't be put up with for long. The only question is, country by country, at which point does the rubber band break? And I think Germany is leading the pack in their foolishness, that the dive over the energy cliff, as we have once described it, and the deindustrialization that has quickly resulted as a consequence was utterly predictable. Would have been a lot worse if last winter had been even slightly colder than luckily it turned out to be. But in the US, we're not immune from such nonsense. California and New England are doing their best impersonations of Germany. In December, just as one small anecdote, the price of natural gas in Europe, in California, spiked to $55 a million BTU. And at the exact same time in Texas and the Permian Basin, the price of natural gas went negative. They couldn't give it away. Why? There's no pipelines to connect the two regions. And so California, the citizens of that country, when they needed energy the most, had to pay through the nose for it. And, at some point, when people have to degrade their standard of living enough, they will revolt. Let's hope it's peaceful.
Let's hope. Now, let's imagine for the moment, setting aside some of the technical issues, that the path to alternative energy was viable. My concern is that I read people like Professor Simon Michaud, and he says, hey, there seems to be some resource constraints here, just mining throughput, even if the ore grades were there, which is questionable, but just the pace at which we would have to mine things exceeds any possible parameters I can get my head around. But then, I read things like out of Stanford, you got there, who's that guy, Toby? The professor there who says, this is easy. We can do this, and it's going to pay for itself in spades. All we have to do is get serious about electrifying the grid and cars and stuff like that. He makes it seem easy. Of course, that professor, as far as I know, never worked in a manufacturing facility in his life or a mine, so maybe doesn't quite know what's involved. Where do you fall on that spectrum of can't do it, it's easy?
Can't do it. I mean, it's all you have to do is consult physics. Look, we have a phrase around the chicken coop, and we like to say it divisively. It works in universities, right? As you say, like everything works great on a spreadsheet. And another way to say it is, in a world with no constraints, anything is possible. But ultimately, you must confront your constraints. They cannot be circumvented, and especially when your constraints are the laws of physics. What do you think powers all of those giant machines that extract the low-grade ore, that send it to the mills, where it gets ground and pulverized into fine powder, and then it gets floated with various forms of chemicals, which produces all manner of waste that need to be treated and separated, and the entropic penalties that need to be paid in order to make that happen, just to produce a concentrate, which then gets shipped to a smelter, where it gets heated to enormous temperatures, and these metals are further separated into their pure form, so that they can then be shipped to manufacturing facilities where they get recombined with the elements that they were originally discovered with in nature, but in a more controlled way, to make things like zinc-coated steel for automobiles and so on. All of this stuff comes with a fundamental energy penalty, and almost all of it is paid by fossil fuels today. And there's no amount of wind turbines or solar panels that is going to allow us to circumvent that fundamental penalty of physics. You could calculate it. It's there. It's undeniable. It's fact. It's not even speculation. And so to see the AOCs of the world in New York, for example, talk down to the engineers and the scientists and the patriots who built this country, who laid down the foundation of of the infrastructure that we have that we're all really decapitalizing today. We are, monetizing the energy investments of generations that have come before us, as we stand around and wait for everybody to regain their senses. And the big question is, how far do we stretch that band before it breaks?
Well, I want to talk about that because but before I get there, let's get into the, I guess, the meat of this, which then is, where do you fall on the what some people call a theory? I call it a geologic observation of peak oil.
We would fade peak oil. I think peak oil is a concept for techno pessimists, and I think that for those who have never worked in the commodity sector, they have a perhaps superficial understanding of the deep level of brilliance, expertise, technology, and engineering that is deployed each and every day to keep the lights on. And these people, with the full force of capitalism as the wind in their sails, are forever inventing increased efficiency, new technologies. And I do think that the primary limitation to our ability to discover and exploit fossil fuels is regulatory and political. It is not technical and not even really financial. And so we could perhaps impose peak oil on ourselves out of choice, but we are deeply bullish the human spirit. We don't suspect that we will be running short on economically developable fossil fuel resources. Our ability to convert resources into reserves scales with our technological development and our progress in that regard. And not barely a day goes by where we don't see improvements in computing and engineering and drilling and the science that backs these highly technical companies. It always amuses me when people think that Google and Facebook are technology companies. If you ever visited the headquarters of Saudi Aramco or ExxonMobil, you would know what a true technology company is.
Interesting. Now, I take slightly the other side of that. I mean, globally, I know there's a lot out there still because they haven't even begun to do the horizontal drilling in any of the very, very rich shale layers that underlie much of the Middle East. The Vaca Muerta in Argentina, politically, it's a nightmare to try and get to it. But man, that looks like an intense play. It could rival the Permian from what I've seen. But the shale basins do come and they do go. You get through your tier 1 acreage relatively quickly. My concern is that our own energy information agency, headed up by the inestimable Jennifer Granholm, is still convinced that we have 30 years of 12.5 million barrels per day coming out of combined things like that. I'm looking at this. I see we're about 2 years away from getting through the prime tier 1 acreage in the Permian. We're already through it in the Bakken, already past it in the Eagleford. So those look to me like there's stuff there. We'll get it. The technology will help. But in terms of getting more oil out, I don't see it.
I would say I would preface your comment by saying that you pointed out the political environment in which these companies are operating. So they're two separate questions. Do I think that peak oil is inherently a thing? Yes or no? And do I think that within the current constraints in the environment that we're operating, that we will see decreased production of oil, let's say in the US or even globally? Those are two separate questions. And in fact, I would point you to a fascinating announcement by ExxonMobil on June 1st, where they talked about how they had developed technologies that they believed will allow them to double the amount of oil they could produce from the existing shale patch over the next 5 years. And I go back to when you bet on peak oil as an inherent phenomenon, you are shorting human ingenuity. Now, if you're betting on peak oil as a political phenomenon and you're going long political incompetence, those are two very different bets. And so I don't think we're actually disagreeing. I think if truly unfettered, we could produce all of the fossil fuels that the world could afford. I don't believe that there is a fundamental geographic constraint that society is rubbing up against. I do think there are political constraints, permitting, nuisance lawsuits, lack of return for investor capital because of those two things. And of course, mismanagement on the part of the executives of these companies also doesn't help. They tend to overproduce at all the wrong times, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, from a geographic or geological perspective, I think we have many, many centuries of fossil fuels available to us if we have the political will to exploit them.
I'd have to look at that. I did read that Exxon thing, and I ran it past some people who are actually in the fracking business. Said, "Does this pencil out?" And they said, "Well, maybe, maybe not." This idea that you're going to go in and refrac holes, seal them up, and then punch new holes in there. Delta P becomes a thing, and when once you depressurize a field, it's very hard to get that back, right? So I'm gonna wait and see on that one, but I'm a wait and see guy on all kinds of technology. I want to get to that in a bit because I've been very skeptical of LK99 room temperature superconducting, but I extraordinary claims. I'm a Missouri guy, I guess, at heart. Show me. So I'm really skeptical about these things. I've seen a lot of claims come and go, and so I don't want to say I'm jaded, but I'm jaded.
Yeah. Well, you may know that we put a piece out on this topic, and we titled it "Conducting Diligence." And we have developed over the years, as a technology executive in the commodity space, barely a week went by when whoever was the CEO of the company I was employed at, I read something in a Wall Street Journal or Fortune magazine and forwarded it to me and said, "Hey, what do you think of this? Is this real?" And so over time, we have developed a very simple 5-question framework for quickly analyzing such momentous claims as the room temperature superconductor claim that recently made the news. And those 5 questions are actually very basic. And we've used it now twice. We've used it for this, and then we recently used it for the development of a potential magic bullet for cancer, which was also making the headlines. And those 5 questions are very simple. Who is involved? Where was it published? Where are we in the scientific process? What is the scientific context, and what should we expect next? And we walked through all 5 of those questions for the LK99 development. And if you go through them, and if you don't mind, I just might for your audience here. Who's involved? It seems from outside appearances that all of the scientists involved are properly trained and have reputations that they're betting and putting on the line here, which is fine. So that one passes our screen. The next question is where it was published, and this is where things get a little dicey. This wasn't published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was a preemptive preprint, perhaps out of fear of being scooped. Anybody can publish a preprint. It has not been peer-reviewed. It has not yet run the gauntlet of peer review. And look, it's imperfect, and we learned from COVID that all of these things can be corrupted, but by and large, most of the time, it works pretty well. And so for a claim as spectacular as this, it would have been helpful if the media waited until a respectable journal lent the credibility of its editorial process to the work, which they have not. And that's not the world we live in anymore, so that's fine. Where are we in the scientific process? Look, none of this matters until somebody replicates it. People can make a claim. The good news is that the experimental procedures described in the preprint are comparatively simple. We were going to write a follow-up piece where we were going to describe how high throughput heterogeneous synthesis would basically obliterate this entire space in very short order if it was real. You could run thousands of experiments a day with minor nuance changes to temperature ramp, oxygen content, various reagents, and the chemical industry would very, very quickly map out the entire space post haste if this were real. We've not yet seen in the weeks that have since passed any confirmation of that, which gives us significant pause. And then the scientific context is this is a field that is replete with false claims, fraud, retracted papers, misunderstandings, and so on. And the leap that was described here is so profound. It's not like, we've gone from like liquid helium and liquid nitrogen, like the coldest temperatures imaginable, to not just room temperature superconductivity, but superconductive properties above the boiling point of water. And that's just such a chasm that it belies belief. And then, and what should we expect next? Given the fact that everything is so simple, we should expect this to resolve very soon. And there's only 2 possible outcomes. These results will be confirmed, or a fundamental misinterpretation of the data will be revealed. And we do believe that would have been caught in peer review, which is probably what's going to happen based on our continued observation of the attempts to replicate this stuff. And we concluded that piece with our verdict, all the way back on July 28th, which was, we'd be thrilled if this were true. Count us as deeply skeptical. And as we said in the piece, quote, "The leap is too far, the method's too simple, and the process too premature to get excited." And for the sake of the players involved, we certainly hope it's true. And we'd be more than happy to be proven wrong, but we suspect that we won't be.
Well, for people listening, the idea of a room temperature superconductor would change life as we know it. It would be amazing. It would be amazing. You could have a cable the thickness of my finger that would carry as much current as like as many big power lines as you've ever seen strung up on a high tension wire. It would be astonishing with no losses. It would be amazing. I would
More than
I would
that, the most important aspect of room temperature superconductors, in our view, is it was very quickly enable quantum computing, which would change the world in incalculable ways. And so, I mean, I joked with a few of the Bitcoin maxis that we interact with
yeah,
that would be the end of the Bitcoin network because you could easily hack it.
yeah,
And so, this would be the way we described it to our clients is that this would be an invention on par with fission and the development of semiconductors.
it'd be astonishing. So extraordinary claims. Now, there was just a paper came out this morning that I saw for the first time from Beijing University where they recreated the material. And they found that it actually had small little discontinuous chunks within a larger chunk of ferromagnetic properties that then behaved like you would expect on a magnet. So they debunked the Meissner effect, at least in this one paper. So not surprised. It looked like it might be an artifact of crystal, how the crystals grow.
Yeah, we would be deeply, deeply skeptical of a leap this far. We described the synthetic methods involved as kitchen chemistry, which is not to be derogatory in any way, but the methods are so simple that I just know from direct personal experience that the major material science and chemical companies could that the materials involved are very simple, right? Like lead and copper and sulfur. They could ground and pound this stuff out, and I'm sure they're all doing it. I've reached out to a few of our contacts in industry, high up officer level people at these types of companies, and they're all in the same boat, deeply skeptical, have to check. The board is pressuring them. Is this real? What does this mean for our business? We've not yet seen, let's go back to cold fusion, which is perhaps the most famous example of such an amazing claim. Pons and Fleischmann. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story, but out of
Well, I am. I followed that
yeah.
really closely in the day.
So did I. Yeah, I remember the very famous American Chemical Society meeting in Dallas. That turned into really just a frenzy. You might remember that early on, a couple of institutions really debased themselves by prematurely claiming they had replicated the results. And it turned out that they too had made some mistakes in their experimental procedures. And over time, once the serious scientists came in and tried to replicate things, it turned out that it was not real. And if you told me that I had to bet my mortgage on one of the two outcomes, I would bet on it not being real, which is rather unfortunate because I think it does do damage to the reputation of science when the media hypes these things, as we said in the piece, roughly about once a quarter, an advance, a proclaimed advance in the world of science makes the leap into mainstream media's hype cycle. And this, of course, triggers a wave of inquiries from our subscribers. And, good news for us is it gives us stuff to write about, of course, but
that's fun.
Yeah, so we would be deeply skeptical.
Well, so I went into peak oil, and this detour was actually important and relevant to it because when we're thinking through this, I think the thing I'm combating, such as it is for the people who are like, well, we're Americans, and so here's what's going to happen. Even if it turns out, Chris Doomberg, that we get this grid instability, we're smart and we'll figure it out, right? And my concern is that it takes and so this is more of a political question than anything. Nobody wants these windmills in their backyard. Nobody wants another nuclear plant in their backyard. The regulatory burden for creating these new things is miles deep. We don't know how to unwind our regulatory burden. We can add to it. That's easy, right? And my concern is that we're going to get to this future state and go, oh, we got to build a lot of stuff. That requires energy. Where does that energy actually come from? Well, it's going to have to come from oil. At that point, based on everything I'm tracking in the world in terms of who's got what, I see China is by far now the world's #1 importer of oil, and on a rocket sled, they're going to keep that process going. I can see a point in the future where the United States has to then compete for adequate energy supplies to do what it needs to do, which is to begin the expensive, energy-intensive process of rebuilding its core energy infrastructure from the ground up. We might not have the labor there. Let's leave that aside for the moment. I'm just worried energetically that we're going to be in competition at a crisis moment. I don't know. I feel like past performance is not indicative of future success. I'm very worried that we're going to face a future that nobody knows really how to deal with because it hasn't been part of our past.
So there's some positive spins that we could put on the situation, especially for the U.S. relative to other countries. And of course, when it comes to geopolitics, these are all relative competitions. Um, I agree on oil, although we are blessed with an enormous amount of oil in the U.S. and we have, luckily, because of nuances in the way in which our regulatory regime works, certain states have pretty good control over permitting and so on, Louisiana and Texas, and Oklahoma, and the various, the anchors of our energy future. One thing that we are blessed with, which we are not yet fully taking advantage of, is an enormous amount of natural gas, which in many ways is a similarly useful molecule to oil, if for no other reason than, yes, of course, we can't refine it into gasoline, but we can burn it to produce heat, which is an enormous use of energy in the U.S. And north of, New England and California notwithstanding, the pipeline infrastructure exists to support most of the U.S. from this bounty. And, at $2.50 per million BTU, Henry Hub, whatever the number is today, it's somewhere in that range. That's the equivalent of $15 a barrel oil for a really high pure, easy to burn, energy intense molecule. Like we cook in our kitchens with natural gas and don't even think about ventilation, but one would never fire up the barbecue in your kitchen. You wouldn't burn a bunch of coal, in an unventilated area in your house. We are a major producer of natural gas. And just to give you a bit of a sort of McKinsey interview estimate sort of question comparison, the amount of natural gas that we flare or vent, which is a bit of a scandal, and export, if you sum all that up, via LNG exports, that's roughly the same amount of coal that we burn in the US today. Like we could replace the amount of coal that we burn from an energy content basis with the natural gas that we flare, burn, vent, and export. And this is, by the way, at $2.50 a million BTU. Imagine if natural gas were priced at anywhere near parity for oil. At what, $82 WTI today, you're looking at $12, $13 a million BTU natural gas. I can assure you at $13 or $14 per million BTU natural gas, we could produce a hell of a lot more natural gas than we're producing today. And this is really a significant asset in the U.S. repertoire that makes us an energy superpower. Yes, we still import certain forms of oil. We export certain forms of oil that our refining network is not really capable of receiving. But compared to other countries, we are broadly at first level energy independent. And that's with a hand and a half tied behind our back.
Yeah, not me. I live in New England. So
you're screwed, buddy.
I'm screwed. I'm a third world importing nation over here because I live literally a short hop and a skip by pipeline from the world. If it was a country, it would be the world's third largest natural gas producing country. And that's the Marcellus. It's right there. And Elizabeth Warren's like, no, we're environmentalists, no pipelines. We have to liquefy our natural gas and import it by LNG terminal in Boston. It's horrifying.
You get it from Trinidad and Tobago.
It's horrifying.
And you pay European prices. We wrote a piece in December of 2021 in the early days of Doomberg. You'd appreciate this title. And I remember it because I love that piece. New England is an energy crisis waiting to happen. And we've talked through all of this, the Jones Act and the inability to take, but for a pipeline, the kingdom was lost. You're talking about 150 miles away from Appalachia, where, as you say, like, build the damn pipelines. This is how, by the way, at SoCal, you have $55 per million BTU natural gas in December, and in the Waha Hub and in the Permian, they're giving it away because it's associated gas. It's produced with oil. It's a byproduct, and byproduct economics are funny that way. But in Boston, as you mentioned, we import via LNG carriers, non-U.S. flagged, of course, to satisfy the Jones Act. You import liquefied natural gas from Trinidad and Tobago. What a joke! When literally a pitching wedge away, it sits this amazing abundance. And we wrote a piece again in that early 2021 days about a reasonable strategy for U.S. energy. Like we have such an abundance of natural gas Why don't we replace coal with our own natural gas, build the pipelines that we need? We could build a homegrown solar industry if we wanted to. Polysilicon is very energy intense, and we've outsourced that to China, who leverages, dirty coal and slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
A total renaissance with nuclear. And if we're going to electrify our vehicles, let's start with hybrids, where we make use of limited battery materials to abate as much gasoline as we can. These are all very sensible policies, far too sensible for any US politician to implement in today's environment, unfortunately. But yes, if you live in New England, I would buy backup generators and a propane tank, and I would begin at home and protect my family accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all good advice that I give to my subscribers all the time. So I have a wood furnace in the basement, and otherwise it's oil. I have to burn
Mm-hmm.
oil. I feel like someday my great grandchildren, as yet unconceived, unborn, are going to look back and say, "You did what?"
I mean, you're kind of burning diesel, right? I mean, heating
Yeah,
oil, yeah, it's just
it's
got a
diesel.
different dye. It's
Yes.
just amazing. And but I luckily for us, we live in natural gas country, and
Mm-hmm.
they've not yet mandated that we replace our furnaces with heat pumps.
Or your stove. It's coming though. You can feel it's coming, and I just hope we can break this delusion. So as we close out this public portion, how do we how do we begin influencing? Give me some hope here. Tell me that you are talking with people who get it, and that there's a great awakening happening, and our senses are returning.
Look, it's one conversation at a time, and I do think engaging in the political process as opposed to throwing your hands up in the air and just accepting
Mm-hmm.
our fate is, I'd rather die trying than timid. And I would give you one great example of a friend of mine who's done, as an individual citizen, an enormous amount of work. It's our friend, Dr. Chris Kiefer up in Canada, president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, one of the organizations that has enabled a complete about face in the political system in Canada and a re-embracement of nuclear power. This is a total volunteer nonprofit organization that believes in the power of nuclear energy and has done amazing work. Even got a one-on-one meeting with Justin Trudeau, who we are, of course, no fans of, but we give credit where credit is due. When your political opponents make the correct decision on something you care about, you should tip your hat and thank them for it, much as we did when Gavin Newsom worked to save Diablo Canyon in California. And so the alternative to not participating is despair, and we would rather die trying.
Excellent. Well, so for everybody listening, of course, it's doomberg.substack.com. How else can people follow you? And by the way, I highly recommend everybody, you should absolutely subscribe. I'm a subscriber, been a subscriber for a while. I get a lot from your material. It's really worth it. So anywhere else they can follow you? Because I know you're not on Twitter anymore, which
So
is
that's pretty much it. We're all in on Substack,
all in.
doomberg.substack.com. From there, you can see Notes, which is Doomberg's Twitter competitor. You don't need to download an app to see it. If you just go to our webpage, you'll be able to see our notes. You'll see our pieces. You'll see our pro tier. Everything is there. One-stop shop. Our about page describes all our offering. We are 100% subscriber supported. We accept no ads and do no sponsorship work, which nothing wrong with those business models, but we believe this allows us to be as free editorially and provocative as we need to be to get our message out there. And we live and die by our subscribers. And so if anybody listening wants to give us a shot, we'd certainly appreciate your business.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time here today. And for anybody wanting to watch part 2 of this, you can find that over at peakprosperity.com. And we would welcome seeing you there. Doomberg, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.